last year with the news of the brutal gang rape of a 16-year-old girl identified as Liz. After being raped, she was beaten and dumped into a 20-foot deep pit latrine by 6 teens. She sustained several injuries. She is now wheelchair bound. That particular case opened this week in court amid demonstrations, and it received global attention. Now, while we cannot discuss the merits of that particular case, we do want to discuss gender-based violence and why it continues unabated in 2014, perpetrated by mostly men whom women expect to protect them. Professor Edward Kisiangani stays with us on the panel. In the middle, we have Dr. Joanne Nyanyuki. She is the Executive Director at the Coalition on Violence Against Women. Thank you very much for coming. And we have Sid Chatterjee of the United Nations Fund for Population, I believe. He is the representative for Kenya. Thank you both for coming. Sid, let me begin with you. You've worked in many countries. How does the Kenya situation in as far as gender-based violence in 2014 compared to what you've seen in the rest of the world? And I do believe you are of Indian origin. We have seen in news the reports from your country. Perhaps you could also bring in that perspective as you answer.
Sure. Thank you, Anne. Sexual violence is a scourge which is universal in nature and is nothing based on nationalities or countries of origin. And I think what the episode that you recited about Liz, India had something very similar in 2012 in December with the Delhi gang rape episode, which really hit international headlines. And that was for the first time an issue because it hit a city and it was so gruesome, so horrible, something as comparable to what happened to Liz, really put the spotlight on the problem. And I think technology today has allowed us to really get a better perspective of what's going on. But it is a universal problem. 60% of women, you know, or girls have experienced some form of sexual violence or the other across the world. Now that's a very, very high number. And perpetrators, absolutely, you're right, are men. You know, there is perhaps a need for the world to really revisit. You know, we heard about value systems from the professor in the earlier part of the discussion. But there are other important issues, and that is about education. It's about, you know, it is about stopping discrimination taking place at homes. You talked about India. I think discrimination starts in the womb, where a girl is not even allowed to be born, for example. Whereas, you know, and then when we come into schools, we see a tradition, a culture of misogynists, a culture of that male is dominant and beating a woman is an acceptable norm. UNFPA supported an assessment in Kenya, for example, where gender-based violence was not seen as a crime a few years ago. So I think it is a scourge which needs to be tackled head-on. And I think it's a scourge where more men need to stand up and talk against it.
Very interesting, that the report that you've cited that you carried out. Why, Doctor, even with the presence of legislation, do you think our communities still don't see gender-based violence, violence against women, as a major thing? In fact, most homes would prefer to deal with such a situation internally, outside of a legal system that does provide stiff penalties for such crime.
I think it's very unfortunate what it is that you're talking about, Anne. And I'll pick up from what Sid just said. When you have such deep-rooted cultural norms where a woman or a female person is treated as being of lesser value, and then this cultural norm, these social norms are perpetuated, and then you see that regardless of there being legislation on this one end, the belief system of people, of our community, of our society, is such that it actually perpetuates and sustains violence against women, against girls. So what we really need to do actually is to start from the home, from community level, from schools, talking about what gender-based violence is, that it is not acceptable. A woman is of equal value to a man, and this starts from the girl child being of equal value with a boy. And therefore, in that sense, when people change, and then you find expecting, therefore, that legislation will roll out, be implemented, those who are responsible will play their part, then you can find that if you couple cultural norm changes and then effective legislation where impunity no longer goes, perpetrators are punished, then you can expect to see some change. So it's a challenge to all of us.
Yeah, you know, Sid, yesterday, well, actually 2 days ago, I spoke to the UN Women Deputy Executive Director, and part of what she said the problem is that we do not have enough women holding judicial positions, if you like, or positions within the legal system. Do you think that having more women as police officers, in the judiciary, as lawyers, etc., will help bring perhaps faster resolution, faster response to such cases?
I agree completely, but it has to be multifaceted. You know, I had written an article some time ago in The Hindu where I talked about the challenge that we have in terms of sexual violence and what needs to really happen. It's a three-pronged approach. There is one pronged, as my colleague mentioned, is to start at the community level, is to start at homes, is to sensitize people. The second prong is to sensitize law enforcement agencies. Do you know that a lot of the policemen are not even aware of women's rights? So I think it's an important part of it, is to educate them, is to make them understand it. And absolutely, the Deputy Executive Director is is absolutely correct. We have to ensure that there are more women who hold positions of authority and influence in law enforcement of all its forms, including the judiciary. But the third and the most critical part of this, Anne, is what I call the shock and awe of justice. The justice must be exemplary, regardless of rank and station, regardless of a person's political standing or non-political standing, regardless of his personal wealth or lack of it. The punishment should be exemplary to the extent that it terrifies any man even attempting to do it again. Because today what has happened is the recklessness and the brutality which is being visited on underage girls, you know, and we are seeing it in conflict-affected areas, in areas affected by natural disasters. And these are women who are being psychologically scarred for life at a very early stage. So I just think that it needs, as I said, a multifaceted approach.
Okay. Prof, I'm going to come to the final comment. And according to the National Council on Population and Development, the regions with the highest gender-based violence prevalence in Kenya are Nyanza, Western, and the Rift Valley. As we wind up, what do you think needs to be done specifically to help communities appreciate women, or appreciate just how terrible gender-based violence is? And your final thoughts on what you've heard the rest of the panel say.
I think for me, Anne, the starting point should be for us to go back to the drawing board. It is about the diagnosis of the problem. We must re-diagnose it, because in some communities, gender-based violence has been normalized as normal, and in others, it has been seen as criminal. So we have two messages coming from the same society. What we really need is to say that from day one, there is nobody who should be forgiven for doing this, and gender-based violence is wrong. And once we do that, we shall isolate anybody involved in gender-based violence, whether it's a woman or a man. But they must be isolated and treated as criminals.
The shock and awe.
Yes, hardcore criminals who must be isolated from society. Doesn't matter in which society they are. But when you allow things to happen like the ones in Busia, and they have even happened in other parts of the country, where even administrators, most of them men, forgive those who have done. And in fact, in the Busia case, they even started slashing grass. So they said, you have normalized it into a misdemeanor instead of a serious crime. So we must declare it a serious national crime and prescribe accordingly the punishment to be meted out. These people must be isolated. That is why prisons were created in the 19th century and 18th century. Isolate these criminals from the rest of the society. There must not be discussion on this matter.
I thank you all. It's unfortunate that we do not have enough time to discuss it, but I hope that this conversation will continue, and I know it is on social media. Thank you so much for your feedback. I'd like to thank Sid Chatterjee, the UNFPA representative for Kenya, Dr. Joanne Nyanyuki, the Executive Director at the Coalition on Violence Against Women, Professor Edward Kisiangani, and of course my previous guests, who I'll be thanking a little later. But first, let's go straight to the sports news.